In the bustling streets of Athens, the air smells of roasted meat and wine. But in the shadows, another scent lingers: fear. A girl, no older than 13, is dragged by the wrist. She has no name here, only a price. Her new master doesn't ask about her family or her dreams. He counts coins, and with that exchange, her life is rewritten. Freedom is gone in a single transaction. She is no longer human in the eyes of the law. She is property. Slavery in ancient Greece was not hidden, not whispered about behind closed doors. It was celebrated, normalized, and woven into the very fabric of society. Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, thrived not in spite of slavery, but because of it. Every shining temple, every bustling agora, every philosophical debate was sustained by hands that could never claim ownership of their own labor. Yet among the enslaved, women bore the heaviest chains. To be a slave was already to lose autonomy, but to be both a slave and a woman was to exist at the lowest possible rung of society. Double oppression defined their lives. A male slave might one day purchase freedom, serve in the mines, or handle transactions on behalf of his master. A woman, however, was far more likely to be confined to invisible suffering, silenced, exploited, and forgotten. Why does history remember the names of philosophers, generals, and poets, yet erase the women who sustained their households and pleasures? These women were not simply invisible labor. They were the hidden machinery of Greek society, shaping every corner of life while being denied even the dignity of personhood. Consider the paradox. Athens prided itself on its ideals of justice and equality, but those ideals stopped abruptly at the threshold of slavery. The same citizens who debated ethics in the assembly would return home to women who could be ordered, abused, or discarded without consequence. In many households, female slaves lived under constant threat, expected to serve meals, weave textiles, and raise children who might themselves be born into chains. Their lives reveal the dark underside of what we call civilization. Ancient Greece, so often idealized in textbooks and tourist guides, was built not only on marble and philosophy, but on human suffering. And within that suffering, women endured uniquely cruel burdens. They were simultaneously laborers, servants, companions, and victims of unchecked power. It is this double oppression that compels us to look closer. To tell their story is not to tarnish Greece's legacy, but to confront the reality beneath the myths. If we remember only the triumphs, the art, the democracy, the philosophy, we preserve half a truth, and half a truth is often more dangerous than a lie. This video seeks to uncover what was normal in ancient Greece, but should horrify us today. The brutal lives of female slaves. We will journey beyond the polished image of statues and ruins, into kitchens where women toiled endlessly, into bedrooms where consent was never considered, into workshops where small hands wove endless cloth for markets they could never shop in. Through their stories, we peel back the shining mask of antiquity to reveal the wounds carved into those who had no voice. These forgotten women demand remembrance, not out of pity, but because history without them is incomplete. Their chains rattled in the silence of history, and today we must listen. And so we begin with the understanding that behind every golden age lies a shadow. The story of Greece is not just democracy and drama, it is also domination and despair. To know the truth, we must walk with the enslaved, especially the women who bore the heaviest burdens. From here, we move into the legal framework that defined their lives not as people, but as possessions. In Greek law, the enslaved woman was not a person, but an object. She could be bought, sold, traded, inherited, or even rented out, just like a jug of wine or a farm tool. Her value was determined not by her humanity, but by her utility. How many hours she could labor, how many children she could bear, how many pleasures she could provide. The irony is staggering. Athens boasted of its democracy, where every citizen supposedly had a voice. Yet this democracy rested firmly on the silence of countless enslaved women, whose lives ensured the comfort of their masters. Citizens debated the ideals of freedom while standing on the backs of those who had none. A female slave's fate was often sealed at birth. If born to an enslaved mother, she inherited her mother's status, trapped in a cycle from which escape was almost impossible. Even when purchased later in life, she was stripped of identity, folded into her master's household as mere property. Within households, treatment varied, but the underlying reality never changed. In some wealthy homes, female slaves served as nurses to the master's children, pouring affection into infants who would grow to own them. In others, they cooked, cleaned, or spun wool until their hands were raw. But there were darker stories too. Women kept in conditions worse than livestock, denied basic nourishment, or punished with cruel beatings for the smallest mistakes. Consider the chilling words of ancient texts where slaves were compared to living tools. They were extensions of the master's will, without rights, without protection. A broken tool could be discarded, so too could a woman. The hypocrisy is difficult to ignore. Temples were erected to goddesses of wisdom and fertility, yet the women who labored in devotion to these gods were treated as disposable commodities. A male citizen might inherit land. A woman could inherit nothing except perhaps her mother's chains. In households where wealth was displayed through the number of slaves owned, female bodies were counted like livestock. Their humanity was erased in ledgers, reduced to columns of numbers, values, and transactions. A woman might move from one household to another, traded not because of any wrongdoing, but because her master needed cash or sought to curry favor. Even the language of ownership reveals the brutality. Inheritance documents list women alongside furniture, passed from father to son as if they were heirlooms. To the master, their lives were wealth. To the women themselves, they were a prison. Yet in these conditions, women found small ways to endure moments of connection with one another, whispered songs while working the loom, tender care for each other's children. These were fragile acts of humanity in a world determined to erase it. But the law allowed no recognition of their personhood. They could not testify in court, could not own property, could not even control their own bodies. Everything they were belonged to someone else. From property, it was only a small step to the next grim reality, the way their bodies themselves became tools of service, not only in labor, but in intimacy. If slavery stripped women of their freedom, it also claimed their bodies. In ancient Greece, female slaves were not only expected to labor, but to serve as instruments of pleasure. Sexual exploitation was not an exception. It was a norm woven into society's fabric. In the private chambers of their masters, female slaves became concubines, their consent irrelevant. Some were forced into permanent companionships, others rotated between men at the master's whim. These arrangements were rarely questioned, for a slave had no say in how her body was used. Her silence was expected, her suffering unseen. This culture of exploitation extended into the symposium, the drinking parties where elite men gathered to eat, drink, and debate philosophy. At these events, female slaves were paraded as entertainers. They played music, danced, and served wine. But their role went beyond performance. Guests assumed their availability, treating them as offerings to be shared. Pleasure and degradation blended seamlessly under the flickering light of oil lamps. For some, this meant forced intimacy in front of laughing spectators. For others, it meant being auctioned to the highest bidder for the night. Ancient texts describe these practices without outrage, as though such violations were as natural as the pouring of wine. And yet, the exploitation was not confined to grand parties. In ordinary homes, female slaves endured routine abuse. A master could summon a servant girl at any time. Wives were often aware but powerless to intervene, for the law granted men near total authority over both slaves and household. In this cruel hierarchy, enslaved women often absorbed the frustrations of masters and mistresses alike. The consequences of such exploitation extended across generations. Children born from these unions were themselves slaves, their very existence proof of an endless cycle of domination. Some were acknowledged, others abandoned, but all were bound by the same chains that trapped their mothers. This normalization of sexual slavery reveals a society that celebrated male freedom while reducing women to vessels of service. Greek philosophers debated virtue and self-control, yet few spoke against the treatment of women as objects. Even when love, desire, and companionship were discussed, it was typically in the context of relationships between men. Women remained absent, voiceless, and dehumanized. Still, these women carried untold stories. Behind every symposium's laughter, there was a woman enduring humiliation. Behind every household's meals, a girl lived with the weight of fear. Their bodies bore scars, some physical, others invisible that testified to the constant trespass of their autonomy. To the Greeks, this exploitation was ordinary. To us, it is chilling. And yet, we must remember, for these women, it was not a single violation, but a lifetime defined by the absence of choice. From the symposium's chambers and household bedrooms, we now step into another brutal arena of their lives, the endless labor that chained their days and nights. When dawn broke over Athens, enslaved women were already at work. In kitchens, fires were lit. In workshops, looms clattered. Their labor was the silent engine of Greek prosperity, unacknowledged yet essential. Inside households, women cooked, cleaned, and spun wool, producing the textiles that clothed their masters and stocked the markets. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and never done. Many were forced to labor while pregnant or ill with no reprieve. Domestic service may sound less brutal than the mines, but it offered no freedom. Every gesture belonged to another's command. Others toiled in textile workshops, where dozens of women sat shoulder to shoulder, weaving cloth for sale. Here they labored long hours, their skill exploited for profit they would never touch. These workshops were notorious for their harsh discipline, where a missed stitch could invite punishment. And beyond the loom, some women were sent to markets, working as vendors on behalf of their masters. Even when allowed to interact with free citizens, they had no independence. Every coin they earned went into another's purse. For the poorest or most expendable, there were darker fates still. Though men dominated the mines, some women were forced underground, hauling heavy loads in suffocating tunnels. Others carried water, broke stones, or performed equally brutal tasks. In these places, gender offered no protection from suffering. Yet the heaviest burden was not only physical, it was generational. Any child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved, ensuring the system reproduced itself. A daughter might follow her mother into the kitchen or loom, while a son was sold to labor in workshops or fields. Mothers watched helplessly as their children's futures were sealed from birth. This generational cycle reveals the cruel genius of slavery. It did not merely capture individuals, it perpetuated itself through bloodlines. Women, forced into both labor and reproduction, became instruments of survival for a system designed to erase them. Even small acts of endurance carried risk. A mother might steal moments to sing to her child, a weaver might whisper stories to her companions, but any display of defiance was dangerous. Their humanity survived in fragments, yet the system crushed those fragments wherever possible. Greek art celebrates muscular athletes and heroic warriors, but the true backbone of society lay in women whose names are lost to history. Their sweat, their hands, their broken bodies sustained the glory of Greece. From labor came discipline, and when the masters feared disobedience, they turned to the tools of terror punishments designed not merely to harm, but to control. Fear was the invisible chain that bound enslaved women as tightly as shackles. Disobedience, real or imagined, was met with swift and brutal punishment. Beatings were common, carried out with rods, whips, or fists. Some women were branded with hot irons, their skin scarred permanently as a mark of ownership. Others were mutilated, ears cut, noses disfigured to ensure humiliation lingered with every glance. Public punishment was especially cruel. An enslaved woman might be paraded through the streets, mocked, or stripped as an example to others. The message was clear: obedience was not a choice, it was survival. Starvation was another tool. A master might withhold food for days, leaving women weak but still expected to work. Sleep was also denied, as punishment could mean long nights chained upright or forced labor until collapse. Perhaps the most devastating cruelty was separation from children. A child could be sold without warning, tearing apart the fragile bonds that gave enslaved women meaning. The grief of such losses was weaponized to enforce submission. Mothers obeyed, hoping to shield their remaining children from the same fate. Ancient sources rarely condemned this violence. Instead, they described it matter-of-factly, as though discipline were no different from tending livestock. Fear was considered a necessary tool of control, a way to ensure loyalty without consent. And it worked. Women lived in constant dread, anticipating pain at every mistake. Terror seeped into daily life, shaping posture, speech, and thought. Submission was not merely demanded, it was internalized. A woman did not only obey because she must, she obeyed because fear had hollowed out the possibility of resistance. Yet, even in this world of terror, fragments of defiance flickered. A whispered insult, a stolen loaf of bread, an attempt to run. But punishment loomed, extinguishing rebellion with swift brutality. The cruelty of these punishments reminds us that slavery was not sustained only by law or labor, but by violence etched into flesh and memory. Fear kept the system intact, generation after generation. And as we leave these shadows of punishment, we step into reflection, into the echoes of this suffering that reverberate far beyond the ruins of Greece. The story of enslaved women in ancient Greece does not end with their own lifetimes. Their suffering, though buried in silence, cast long shadows across history. When we look at later empires, Rome, the Ottoman world, the transatlantic slave trade, we see familiar patterns. Women enslaved not only for their labor, but for their bodies, denied personhood, forced into generations of captivity. The Greek model of bondage, normalized and rationalized by its most celebrated thinkers, set a precedent that echoed through centuries. It is easy to imagine Greece as distant, its tragedies confined to marble ruins. Yet the echoes are closer than we think. In modern times, human trafficking traps women in cycles of exploitation disturbingly similar to those faced in Athens. Around the world, countless women are still bought, sold, and coerced, their voices stifled by the same forces of power and profit that crushed lives 2,000 years ago. The parallels are haunting. The separation of mothers from children, the use of sexual violence as control, the reduction of women to property, these practices live on in different forms. Ancient Greece may be celebrated for philosophy and democracy, but its reliance on slavery reminds us that civilization can wear a mask of progress while concealing deep cruelty. Consider the contradiction: a society that praised freedom while denying it to so many. We must ask ourselves, what contradictions will future generations see in us? Just as we now recoil at Greece's normalization of slavery, what hidden injustices might one day define our own age? The story of female slaves in ancient Greece is not just about the past. It is about the fragility of human dignity when power goes unchecked. It is about the danger of forgetting those whose lives were silenced. And it is about the responsibility we carry, not only to remember but to confront the echoes of slavery in our world today. For every name inscribed in stone, there are countless women whose names were never spoken, whose stories never written. They wove the fabrics, raised the children, served the wine, endured the punishments, and carried the burdens of a civilization that denied their existence. They were invisible in life and nearly erased in history, but memory has a way of resurfacing. By uncovering their stories, however fragmented, we restore a measure of dignity. We acknowledge that Greece's brilliance was built on the backs of women who were never free. The monuments still stand, but behind their beauty lies a foundation of suffering. So when we walk among the ruins, let us not only marvel at the artistry, let us hear the faint echoes of voices once silenced. Let us remember that the same stones that bore the weight of philosophers and citizens also bore the shadows of enslaved women, unseen but essential. History is never only glory, it is also grief. And to honor the past honestly, we must hold both truths together. Ancient Greece gave the world democracy, but it also thrived on the destruction of women's lives. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: what will our descendants say of us? Will they see the brilliance we claim or the suffering we overlook? Just as Greece is judged today, so too will our own civilization be measured by its treatment of the powerless. The forgotten women of Greece cannot speak for themselves, but by telling their story, we ensure their silence does not remain absolute. Their chains may be buried in the dust of centuries, but their echoes endure, warning, haunting, and demanding that we listen.